Hello, James.
Hello, Charles Thomas.
How are you?
Very, very good, and I thank you for calling in. And we are live now, and we have quite a few people attending. And so I just really, again, want to thank you so very much for participating in this today.
Well, you're certainly welcome. It's a pleasure.
How is everything out in Virginia?
Beautiful. Just a beautiful day. We had a little rain last night, but as I was telling you the other day, fall is one of my favorite seasons here. We live on a little farm sort of close to the ocean, which you've visited, and the ocean's still warm enough to swim here in Virginia Beach, and yet the nights are cool and the days are cool, 70 degrees or whatever today. Just lovely, lovely.
Well, that's fantastic. And so, Charles, I would like to share with our guests a little bit about you. And before I do, when I was reviewing your bio, I saw that you have a birthday coming up in about 3 days, so I wanted to wish you a happy birthday.
Oh, you're great, James. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, you know, when we get to be our age, those birthdays are not as, we don't look forward to them the way we did when we were little. But
exactly
good health and a good
Ann
family, lovely family.
Ann and I are both Libras as well, so we have our birthdays coming up on the 12th and 14th. So.
Well, happy birthday to both of you. Please give my love to Ann.
Thank you very, very much. And so let me just share with our guests a little bit about you, and this is on the slide for those of you that are joining in. Dr. Charles Thomas Cayce is the grandson of Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet. Charles Thomas is a prolific author and former president of the A.R.E. and Edgar Cayce Foundation. He is a wonderful speaker and a man of great wisdom and of kind, gentle demeanor. He received a reading from Edgar that stated that he is the reincarnation of Edgar Cayce's beloved grandfather, who was also a mystic and had a huge influence on young Edgar Cayce. Charles Thomas Cayce holds a Ph.D., a doctorate in psychology, and he was a professor at the University of Maryland before returning to serve as president of the Edgar Cayce Foundation and A.R.E. He is the son of Hugh Lynn Cayce, Edgar Cayce's firstborn son, and he will be a keynote speaker at the event we are hosting in Colorado in May of 2015. And he will speak on soul purpose and share some of his insights and personal stories on the life of Edgar Cayce. And I would also like to add that the A.R.E. has had a tremendous impact on my life. And we at Earthkeeper have been all deeply touched and inspired by the work of Edgar Cayce and the Association of Research and Enlightenment. We feel the A.R.E. is the most important and the most credible spiritual organization on the planet. We've visited the A.R.E. twice in the last year, and the entire team of teachers, of staff, of support teams at the A.R.E. are the most welcoming, humbling, and kind people that you can ever hope to meet. And we highly encourage everyone to become a member of the A.R.E., a lifetime member. And we will be beginning next week offering special incentives for people to join the A.R.E. And also at our Colorado Stargate event, there will be a team from the A.R.E. that will be providing sales of books from the A.R.E., specifically of Dr. Charles Thomas's books and John Van Auken, and they will be set up to take memberships. And so it's just a wonderful, wonderful organization, and I can't speak enough about it. And so, Charles, it truly is an honor to have you with us today. And can you share with our listeners a little bit about the A.R.E.?
Well, I'll be happy to, James. And again, thank you for having me. The A.R.E. was set up originally, as you probably know, as a nonprofit organization that people would join in order to get a reading from my grandfather. Edgar Cayce was arrested several times, a few times, for practicing medicine without a license or for pretending to be a psychic. I don't know the specific charges, but those sorts of things in various cities, Detroit and New York and a number of places. And a reading was given asking how this was very stressful for him, I'm told, and it depressed him. He considered to stop. He was just a mess, and maybe we can come back to that. But when a reading was given about how to best prevent this kind of situation from occurring, it was suggested that a nonprofit organization be set up and that a membership, a small membership fee, be charged, and in that way it would prevent Edgar Cayce from being arrested. And so that because these people were members, the people who received readings were automatically members of the association and were part of the research, the ongoing research to determine the validity, the accuracy of the information in the readings. And so that's how it began. And then after he died, there were decisions made, especially by my father, to try to preserve the 14,000 readings that Edgar Cayce had given and that had been carefully transcribed, and to try to index those by subject and try to slowly test the general helpfulness of that information, which had been given for the most part, as you know, James, for individuals. Over half of the readings for people asking questions about their physical health, but on many hundreds and hundreds of other subjects that you know well. And so the association has, and publications occurred, books about his life and so forth, and more and more people have become interested, and now it continues to be, I think, both the association or group of people with similar interests who are interested in testing or researching in their own way, testing the general applicability or application of the information in the readings. And the enlightenment part, boy, James, I used to worry about that, in grade school and even high school, I guess, here at Virginia Beach, where you put down your father's occupation on these forms in school. And boy, when I would try to put manager of association for research and enlightenment, I would bog down in a hurry, and especially with the word enlightenment. What in the world, goodness, what was my father involved with? And I often used to think education, and I still think, although it's a spiritual kind of education that's a focus of the A.R.E. Many people who are members of the A.R.E. find the connection with other like-minded folks, other people who are on the spiritual path, trying to understand who they are spiritually and what their life purpose is, find a connection through the A.R.E. Almost as helpful or more so than the information in the readings themselves. So that's really, I think, what it's about.
Well, it's an absolutely life-changing organization. And Charles Thomas, when you graciously had Ann and I at your house in October of last year, we were deeply, deeply touched. And I think I shared with you that the way that I came across Edgar Cayce. I was actually, by education, I'm an engineer and geologist, and I was working in Brazil as a geological engineer, and I was single at that time, and I was working on the banks of the Amazon River. I was the only American there, and it was an extraordinary place, but it was quite isolated. It was 300 miles west of Manaus, which is where the Rio Amazonas and Rio Negro come together. So it was an incredibly remote area. It was 1978. And I was working there, and I would not leave my cabin at night because we were on the banks of the river, and the mosquitoes were so thick at night that it was just unbelievable. And interestingly, you didn't see any mosquitoes in the daytime. And there were actually dolphins in the Amazon River. There are, and that's a fact. And because of the tannic acids and vegetable essences that are in the river, these dolphins were sort of a pink-purple color, and so I would go down and watch these dolphins who would seem to school around, and the river was about 1 kilometer wide, 13 kilometers wide and 300 meters, or 300 feet deep, 100 meters deep, and wow. A massive river, and at night I would go to my cabin, so I read, and a German man gave me a copy of There Is a River, written by Thomas Suger, and it changed my life. I read it cover to cover, and I was walking on air for days because I had been brought up in Arkansas as my family were devout, born-again Baptist, and I could never totally come to terms with the limits of those teachings, and when I read Cayce, I found those answers, and I have been in gratitude the A.R.E. ever since. I spent 33 years living overseas as a foreigner, and I would come home once a year and buy an entire suitcase full of books from Edgar Cayce and the A.R.E. And that's what I would read for the next year, and it was just, and I did that for over 30 years, and so it's just been an incredible group, and I cannot tell you what an honor it is to speak with you. I want to acknowledge you for the work of your family, of your father, of your grandfather, and of you. And well, so you, just to move on a little bit, Charles Thomas, you became a PhD in psychology and were a professor at the University of Maryland for a number of years. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. And you know, talking about my father James and my grandfather, I am often asked, what was Edgar Cayce really like? And I have a quick answer because I have no memory of him. You mentioned as we began that I had readings from him. I had what were called life readings. Had one of those requested by my parents when I was a few hours old, and then a number of other readings from him up until the time I was 3 when he died. And so I have no conscious memories of him. However, as I'm often asked, what was he like? Let me try, if it's all right, James, let me share a little bit from our family, because I listened to my father and my mother, who both, of course, knew him well, and Gladys, his secretary, and many others. My uncle, my grandfather's younger son, my father's brother, Edgar Evans, who wrote the book on Atlantis and so forth. I heard them answer that question many times. And one of the ways that I have found it most helpful to answer the question is to talk about Edgar Cayce a little bit from 3 different angles. One, just what was the man like? What was he like as a father or a grandfather or a friend and neighbor and so forth? And then a little bit of maybe about his psychic ability. What did he say about his own psychic ability? He was asked over and over what was going on when he would go into this unconscious trance state and answer questions on so many hundreds of different subjects. And then a little bit on the content of his readings. So first, what was the man like? The story that I heard my mother tell most often when she was asked what he was like, she and I was just a year or 2 old, spent a good deal of time in my grandmother and grandfather's home right toward the end of his life, my father was in the Army overseas, World War II, and was away for several years, and was away when my grandfather died, actually. But in any case, my mother would tell this story about the whole family and the little group there. There wasn't an A.R.E. at that time, but the little group of people who were trying to work with him were very excited because the book that you just mentioned, Thomas Chagrew's book, was going to be published and was published, and they received a telegram that several crates, wooden crates of these copies, hardback copies of There is a River, were being shipped to the Cayce home, and people were very excited, and Gladys, Edgar Cayce's secretary, and others called other friends, and a large group, say maybe 50 or so, had gathered in the home when the crates were delivered. And the crates were opened. She said, my mother said that Mr. Cayce opened the crates with a hammer, went out to his shop. He loved to do woodwork in his shop by himself out behind the garage of their home. You know, James, I mentioned to you, I have a wooden table that I want to show you the next time you come here that was made by my grandfather, and on that table I have a piece of lapis that I've been working with that was a gift from you. In any case, he loved to do woodwork, and as the celebration started and my grandfather had opened these wooden crates, and they were taking the books out and they were reading passages to each other and so forth, my mother and my grandmother looked around for Edgar Cayce, where he had disappeared. And they were making little toasts and so forth, and everyone celebrating. They couldn't find him, and my mother went out to the garage, and he was had taken the empty wooden crates out in the garage and was pulling them apart and chopping them up, making kindling for the fireplace. And she was saying that for her that was so typical of him, sort of wanting to be alone and celebrate a little bit alone, and very practical kind of person. He loved to he had a vegetable garden at his home all his life, wherever he lived. He had a grape, not a big vineyard, but some grapevines, and would grow grapes and make in the basement of that home where I used to play as a little boy. He made wine, both from the grapes and from dandelions and canned vegetables, loved to fish by himself. I think there was a good deal of time spent by him with people who were curious about him, who wanted to meet him, who wanted to ask him questions. And so to balance that, there was lots of time spent by him by himself with nature, fishing, gardening, doing woodwork in his shop. And although I didn't know him, I can certainly imagine a person of that sort, very practical, down-to-earth sort of person. There's a little story. I'm going to go on too long here, James, but a little story about this wine that he would make in the basement. This house where they lived at that time for many years, most of their life here in Virginia Beach, was right across the street from the Catholic Church, still there, still here in Virginia Beach, the main Catholic church in Virginia Beach. And there was an old priest who was the priest at the Catholic Church right across the street, who became good friends with Edgar Cayce, and he would come to the basement, and while Mr. Cayce was making wine and working with his canning vegetables and so forth, and they would talk, the priest wanted nothing to do with Edgar Cayce's psychic ability or the content of the readings, but they just liked each other as human beings, as men, and would laugh and tell fishing stories together and so forth. Well, there was an occasion late in Edgar Cayce's life, I guess, after the publication of There is a River, when things were very confused and busy. Mail was coming in mail bags to his home, and my father, as I said, was away in the service. Both boys were in the Army, and a letter was opened while Edgar Cayce was in trance for him to give a reading to the person who was requesting the reading, and the letter was from Germany and was written in German. And as Gladys held the letter, I'm told, his secretary held the letter that was in German, and she couldn't read it. Mr. Cayce began to speak in German. Now, he knew no German, no foreign language, and my grandmother, Mr. Cayce's wife, Gertrude, stopped the reading immediately, and there were several people in the room, someone said, "Go get Father Habits." The priest across the street was from Germany, this old priest, and someone went over. Edgar Cayce's lying, if you can imagine, lying unconscious on the couch, and Father Habits wouldn't come in the room with Edgar Cayce giving the reading. Usually, didn't want to know about it, didn't want to talk about it, but they told him what was going on. He came over, and the story goes, he brought a candle and lighted a candle and held a candle and walked back to Mr. Cayce's study where he was on the couch unconscious, and sat next to Gladys and to my grandmother, sat between the two of them. And as Mr. Cayce began again, he was speaking in German, and Father Habits, the old German priest, was whispering the translation, the rough translation, to Gladys, who was transcribing it in English. Now, can you imagine that, James? It just boggles the mind what was going on there. A very unusual man in one sense, but both in terms of his friendship with that priest and his chopping up the crates that There Is a River came in rather than in there with the celebration. It just shows a little bit of a glimpse, I think, of the kind of person he was.
That is absolutely amazing. Charles Thomas, we have a few questions that are coming in. And
sure.
So, if you don't mind, one of the questions is, what were some of the past lifetimes of Edgar Cayce that he spoke about in his readings?
Sure. I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think, James, that there was a category of readings that came to be called life readings. There were, of the 14,000 readings that he gave, about 2,000 of these readings were called life readings because people essentially asked, those 2,000 people asked, how can this entity, how can this soul, this person, lead a happy, successful life? And that my parents asked that question about me when they got this life reading for me, and these other people who had life readings asked the same thing. And in those life readings, typically about half a dozen past lifetimes as a human being in the earth were described for each of these people. And these were lifetimes where strengths and weaknesses occurred that might well be come up in this lifetime, and it might be helpful to better understand those from the perspective of these past lives. And there were sort of epochs, historical periods that came up over and over, and those periods that were given for these 2,000 or so people who had life readings were also the periods that were given for Edgar Cayce when he gave himself several life readings. And one of those involved ancient Egypt, where he was a priest, an Egyptian priest, and it was in that incarnation, he said in his life reading for himself, where he began to develop these psychic abilities that manifested again in this lifetime as Edgar Cayce. That was an early lifetime. Another one that was given for him in his life reading a very different situation was in early America. And again, many of these 2,000 people who had life readings were also told that they were a part of that historical epoch, revolutionary war time, early time among the founding fathers and the 13 colonies and all of that period in early America. Edgar Cayce, I'm sure you know this, James, but gave a lifetime for himself as a riverboat gambler on the Mississippi River, gave his name, and that in that fairly recent past life, recent compared to ancient Egyptian lifetime, in that fairly recent lifetime as a riverboat gambler, he had this psychic ability, but he misused it. He cheated at cards and he cheated with women, and through the misuse of that psychic ability in that lifetime with this character named John Bainbridge, the effect of the misuse of the psychic ability, the selfish and destructive use of the psychic ability, the karma from that in this lifetime was that the psychic ability was unconscious. He until toward the very end of his life, I'm told, he was not psychic at a conscious waking level. He had to go into this unconscious trance state in order to touch on his psychic ability and use it to help people. And of course, he was very focused on trying to help people.
You know, Charles Thomas, the John Bainbridge lifetime has been an area that has had tremendous interest for me, and I've given it a lot of thought, and it provides a lot of really beautiful things for me to contemplate. And one of those would be that no matter how high we go in any one lifetime, we still have the responsibility to maintain the integrity of what has been gained in order to keep it. And another question, and this is what I want to pose to you that has come to me before or that I've contemplated, is the idea that all lifetimes are simultaneous. And this has been taught by people like Seth, Jane Roberts, and Metatron speaks about time. In the third dimension, space is fixed and time flows, whereas on the other side of the veil, time is fixed and space flows, you might say.
Right.
And there is that idea that all lifetimes exist simultaneously. And that posed for me the question, if that's the case, are all of our lifetimes in linear sequence? And I wondered, and I would be interested in your feelings, could John Bainbridge have been an earlier lifetime for Edgar Cayce, although it was not linear, but could it be a lifetime when he came in perhaps even before Egypt? What are your feelings on that?
I agree with everything you said, of course, James. I think it's hard for us to grasp a no time, no space, or all time is one time concept. The Cayce readings certainly suggest that that's the case beyond this physical dimension in the earth plane that we're involved with as souls right now. And I certainly think that that's a possibility. I don't know, when you start using the term before, if the John Bainbridge was before, could that have been a before ancient Egypt?
A lesser developed soul.
Yes, I think absolutely yes. I think that's certainly a possibility, and thought about that also. It certainly makes things more complex and at the same time more understandable if we add this concept of no time and space as we understand it beyond this physical dimension.
The idea that maybe certain lifetimes are connected to certain lifetimes, and then there are certain lifetimes, I think, that we choose in a way to embrace, manner of speaking, our dark side, just to understand the other side of the coin. To
Absolutely.
That we have to learn the importance of the right path, and then sometimes we learn that through the school of hard knocks, or what you might call the university of duality, of free will, cause and effect, and it's fascinating. Charles Thomas, there's a book written by Pulitzer Prize winner Kurt Vonnegut called Slaughterhouse-Five. Have you ever read that book or seen that movie?
I've heard of the book. I have not read it, James.
It came out years ago, and it's
Sure.
about a man who became unstuck in time, and he would live different parts of his lifetime out of at one point he'd be a prisoner of war in Dresden, Germany, and in another part he would be older and be a dentist, and he's talking about the nonlinear aspect of time, that he became unstuck. And Kurt Vonnegut uses the vehicle of saying that extraterrestrials came and took him to another planet, and when he was there, he could look back at his lifetime, and this is the phrase that I've always remembered. He said, when you look at earthlings from a higher perspective, they're one being with baby legs on one end and old person legs on the other, like a span of the Rocky Mountains, and that always fascinated me.
Oh, my goodness.
You could see every aspect. But another question has come in, and that is, was Edgar Cayce Pythagoras? Apparently, who was the novelist, the New York Times bestseller that wrote about Cayce? Is it Stanley Kirkpatrick?
Sidney Kirkpatrick.
Sidney Kirkpatrick. I was listening to an interview that he gave on the A.R.E. a few years ago, and he was given access to some of the unpublished readings that Cayce gave, and these were fascinating. He gave readings for Tesla, for Thomas Edison. And these are kept in a vault, from what I understand. But he mentioned in this interview that there was a reading that he had been Pythagoras, and there was also a mention in that interview that Edgar Cayce had been a Sunday school teacher, and he said that's fascinating because one of the readings indicated that he wrote one of the books of the Bible.
Well, James, Sidney Kirkpatrick is a close friend, and he certainly spent lots of time here in the archives, looking at the readings and working with Edgar Cayce's diaries and journals and so forth. But there are a few readings that are not out in the public. I mean, there are stories about Wilson's cousin coming and meeting with
Right.
Harmon, but in any case,
apparently there's a book written by William Church.
Yes.
And
yes.
And he mentions that Cayce had been Pythagoras.
That may be the case. It may be in his life reading that he was given a lifetime as Pythagoras, and he was also given a lifetime during one of these epochs that I was referring to, like ancient Egypt, was one about the time of Jesus, and Edgar Cayce, as a character by the name of Lucius, was involved in helping to develop the early church and in writing early treatises, some of which became the early books of the Bible, and that is certainly the case. And I'll check on the Pythagoras thing. That's probably
Yeah. Absolutely amazing. And so you taught psychology at the University of Maryland, and then came back to the A.R.E. Was there a certain point in your life, Charles Thomas, when you became drawn back into the work of your grandfather and your father, and you certainly have had an amazing life. And before you answer the question, I just want to point out to our listeners that when I was speaking with you a day or two ago on the phone, and I was asking you about books that you had written, and then I went on the internet, and in fact, I'm showing a slide on this now. But you have either written or edited or done forwards for over 18 books, according to what I saw on the internet. And in addition, I saw on iTunes, and this is what I want to mention to our listeners, I found about 14 or 15 courses that you narrate based on the Edgar Cayce readings that are available on iTunes. And these are realizing psychic potential, tuning your chakras, everything from getting a good night's sleep to overcoming cancer, loss of a loved one, learning to enjoy life and learning, and freedom from smoking, prosperity. These are just prolific topics. These are available on iTunes for our listeners and are narrated by Charles Thomas Cayce. So,
some of those you just mentioned have to do with a concept that's so accessible to all of us that comes up over and over in the readings. You were asking about the University of Maryland and me coming to work at the A.R.E.
Yes.
And my training is as a child psychologist. And one of the ways that I got excited about coming to work at the A.R.E., besides my father just needing help, he said, this was in the late 60s, and Jeff Stern's book had just become a New York Times bestseller called The Sleeping Prophet. And there were huge public interest, and the A.R.E. was a small little organization, and my father just needed help, and I agreed to come for a year and try to help, and I never left. I came for a year and stayed for the rest of this lifetime, I think. But part of my interest was, in the way my father sort of stimulated my interest, was that from time to time, parents, typically, of children who have a great deal of psychic ability contact the A.R.E. wanting to know what to do, what's going on with their child. Is it really psychic ability? And if so, what should they do? And so I have had the wonderful opportunity over the years, especially in those very early years of mine with the A.R.E., when my father was still alive, to do some research with some children, which the Cayce, Edgar Cayce's readings, that was very important for the A.R.E. to do, that it would attract people who had psychic ability, and of course people who were interested in psychic ability. And so that was part of what really drew me to the A.R.E., an opportunity to research more carefully some of the information in the Cayce readings. But for early in my life, in college and even in graduate school, I was on the West Coast at the University of California, as far as I could get from Virginia Beach, James, in the psychology department. And yet, when I began to try, I decided to just, in spite of the accuracy of the readings that my grandfather had given for me, I wasn't at all sure that I wanted to work in the organization and sort of be in the shadow of my grandfather and father and all of that. So I tried some of these tools that are just right at the heart of the Cayce readings, working with my dreams and meditation and prayer and working with setting ideals, and those are all stories for another time. But it jolted me how powerful and helpful and clear that those tools were for me, and how helpful for me. And as I worked with the material, especially related to children from the Cayce readings, there is this thing that comes up over and over about using the time just as children are going to sleep, adults too for that matter, but children also, as they're going to sleep, to give them gentle suggestions, positive suggestions about changes that would be helpful in their life, whether it's stopping wetting the bed, or much more serious emotional kinds of problems. And as we've worked with that tool of pre-sleep suggestion, it's become clear from in the psychological community and clear from our research with that information in the Cayce readings that can be very helpful. And so these things about getting a good night's sleep and stopping smoking and so forth, some of those are scripts that I put together to for people to use as they're going to sleep to make those particular changes in their lives, and those have proven to be helpful.
Well, I am certainly going to download some of those, and I think that as I mentioned, Charles Thomas, I awoke spiritually or into greater knowledge through Edgar Cayce in 1978. And over the next 33 years, I was a foreigner. I never lived in the United States, at least in relation to my job. We lived in Africa. We lived in Russia. I lived in India, South America for 9 years. And I just read. And Cayce's, a lot of people may not realize that the diversity of the Cayce reading. He really spoke a lot about science and other fascinating topics that are timeless. That Sidney Kirkpatrick mentioned in an interview that there is a reading in which he gives directions on how a perpetual motion machine could be developed for an engineer.
That's true.
And so his information is more, in my opinion, more pertinent now than ever. It's always been pertinent, but it's so important now. And because Edgar Cayce read the Bible once a year for his life in a commitment, that is why I believe that the text of the readings, taps into the channel mind to an extent. And so some of the readings are sort of in biblical vernacular and biblical form of English. And so there may be a tendency on some people to think that this is old information. And I am absolutely here to tell you otherwise. The Edgar Cayce information is important now, perhaps more important now than ever before. And I highly encourage those of you listening to read Cayce, to join the Association of Research and Enlightenment. If you have an opportunity, attend the conferences there. The people at the A.R.E. and this is what I spent so much time, Charles Thomas, reading all of the religious information when I was overseas. I didn't watch television. I never lived in an English-speaking country, so I read. And in retrospect, it makes sense that I chose that for myself, but I read everything. I worked in Muslim countries, I worked in Buddhist countries and Hindu countries, and I read all of the religious texts. And then I got into Jane Roberts, Seth, Lobsang Rampa, all of the other things. And it is the Edgar Cayce information that brings me back into the energy of the Christos, the energy of humility, the energy that feels home. I have a tendency as a scientist to really get into the scientific aspects, but it is the Cayce readings, the Cayce energy, and the people of the A.R.E. that carry that feeling of home, of soul family, and that's so important. We can get into the scientific aspects of metaphysics and the ideas of nonlinear time and all of that, and it's important knowledge. But it is the Cayce information that brings me back into soul purpose, and I think that is so very important.
Well, it's spoken beautifully, James. Thank you. I hope that's the purpose of A.R.E. really to touch people such as yourself, and I hope we can keep doing that.
Well, Charles Thomas, I tell people the A.R.E. is the most important spiritual organization. You go to some of these conferences, and there's almost an aloof situation where there's a speaker on the stage, a channel on the stage, and it's like you're in class attending, and while the information is valuable, you don't get that necessarily, you don't get the interaction, you don't get that family feel, and you don't get the opportunity to approach. And everyone I have met in the A.R.E. is extremely approachable, down to earth, and carry this humility. And I think that that's one of the things that the Edgar Cayce work teaches so well, is the importance of humility, that once we get into self-aggrandizement, then we're no longer carrying the vibration, of the pattern, of the light. And so we have another question here, Charles Thomas, and we'll end in about 15 minutes, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
The question is, in these times when things seem to be going so fast, how do we maintain soul purpose, and what is soul purpose, briefly, based on the Edgar Cayce reading?
Well, I would certainly agree that things seem to be moving very fast in lots of different ways, whether we're just in so many ways. And there is a for me at least, James, a core of tools, just basic tools that are in the Cayce readings that are mentioned over and over again as people ask. I mean, certainly the most frequently asked question in the Cayce readings was, one of the most certainly was how can I grow spiritually? What do I need to do to improve my life from a spiritual perspective? And there were these tools that were mentioned over and over again, and many people are frustrated, I think, that this is not a secret formula that some magic words that you can recite at midnight every night for 28 days and you're suddenly transformed spiritually. These are tools that some of them are defined in a little different way by the Cayce readings, but they're tools that we have heard about in Sunday school, in a sense, or certainly we've read about in our reading of spiritual literature. And they're things like working with meditation and the setting of ideals. And the Cayce readings define ideals in a fairly specific way, not goals, but a higher focus than goals, and working with what the Bible talked about and the Cayce readings talked about as the fruits of the Spirit, gentleness and kind, choosing, just taking ourselves by the scruff of the neck, moment by moment, I mean dozens of times a day, and choosing those fruits of the Spirit as we respond to each other. And a key, James, in the readings, I've been doing a seminar recently on 18 readings given for individuals, 18 different people, life readings, who were told that this might well be their last incarnation in the earth. Using my language, so if they played their cards right, they might well be finished with the earth plane this go around. And as a psychologist, I slipped on my psychologist hat and looked at those readings, and I had access to the names of the people who had those readings, and knew some of those people, no family members, but knew some of them pretty well, and looked at the correspondence and so forth. And there are half a dozen key tools. One of those is not holding grudges, and that's the word from the readings, and it's in all 18 of these people's readings. That not holding resentment and jealousy, anger, hurt involving relationships, and committing to the proposition that there is a continuity to life, and that there is a non-physical aspect to us that can grow, can evolve, that the readings talk about as a soul, and that we commit time and energy and focus of our lives to that proposition. So anyway, there are these tools, and they don't sound in a way, especially as you mentioned, James, in the language of the reading, sometimes sort of biblically oriented. They don't sound very flashy or super secret, and yet they are just, in my experience, just key and central to the Cayce readings perspective on how we move spiritually in this lifetime. And again, as a child psychologist, James, I was fascinated by dozens and dozens, hundreds really, of parents who asked Edgar Cayce in readings how could they, as parents, get in closer touch with God, and especially how could they explain God and help their children come to a close relationship with God. And over and over, almost without exception, few exceptions, but almost without exception, the answer was in nature. In nature. Now, you're a geologist, James. You know the beauty. I mean, it's not just beauty. There is a life force that we can experience in nature that we can also easily get away from in this fast-moving society in which many of us live. And I would, again, it almost sounds like going backwards, but I would just refer again to this repeated suggestion in the readings to stay in touch with and get in deeper connection with nature as a way to center ourselves as we move through these crazy times we're in.
Well, Charles Thomas, when you and I were speaking earlier this week, we were talking about Virginia Beach, how Edgar Cayce had been told to go there, and that it was a special energy, and that the sand along the beaches had an unusually benevolent composition of beneficial trace minerals, including gold. And I'll tell you a funny story. I read that, and Edgar had actually mentioned that it's beneficial to bury yourself in the sand.
Yeah.
And so, are you still there?
I am.
Hello?
I am.
Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm here.
My phone has cut off twice, so I'm just checking. But I read
Sure.
that when Ann and I were living in Brazil, and I was in my 20s. And we had just moved to a new section of Brazil, and the entire population of Brazil, if you look at the map, is on the coast, with just one or two exceptions. And so we went to a beach, and in Brazil at that particular time, you had certain beaches that were guarded and safe, and certain beaches that weren't, and we didn't know that. And so we went to the beach, and it was a gorgeous beach, beautiful day. And so I said to Ann, I'm going to bury myself in the sand, because the Cayce book talks the benefits of that. And so I buried myself dug a little hole. She buried me in the sand, and there were a couple of guys watching that. And so as soon as I got buried, they walked up and grabbed Ann's purse and took off running.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. Well, that is certainly... That's a part of the Cayce reading.
Well, I was young and fit, and so I burst out of it, and then I went and chased these guys and caught them, and then they pulled a knife on me and took my watch, and so...
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. Well, you're going to need to come back here and bury yourself in this sand right here in front of the A.R.E. thing.
Where you do it. That was just a funny story, but I absolutely the next time we come to Virginia Beach want to do that. But I do believe, part of what I studied was that there are certain places on the earth that I think have always been recognized as sacred, and that maybe the veil is thin, and I think Virginia Beach is one of these. And I attribute it to a lot of different reasons. There are different types of what I call sacred sites, and I think mineralogy has a lot to do with it. And so I know that Virginia Beach is a place that Cayce also said would be safe in the event of Earth changes, and that had a very, very special light. And so it's just an amazing place. And there's been a lot of new changes at the A.R.E. That facility is just beautiful. There's a library. That meditation room is just amazing. And so I really want to encourage everyone. And I'm speaking with Allison Ray, Charles Thomas, and to our listeners, and we are going to they have agreed to set up a very special discounted rate for membership to the A.R.E. for people attending our event in Colorado. And we have a very, very special event, May 29th through June 1st in Denver, Colorado. It's called the Earthkeeper Stargate, and we have some incredible speakers. Our keynote speakers are Dr. Charles Thomas Cayce, John Van Auken, who is just an amazing man, and we have Dr. Robert Schock. We have David Hatcher Childress, Graham Hancock, John Major Jenkins, Dr. Rick Strassman, as well as Dr. Joseph McNamara and Dr. John Ryan. And we have Joanne Parks and Max, and Michelle Nocerino and Shauna Ra. And Charles, I was speaking with John Van Auken a while back, and John had written an article about crystal skulls. And I often, Edgar Cayce speaks about halls of records, how the Atlanteans, recorded data for future generations. It is, the memory basis of computers is silicon, and quartz is silicon dioxide. And I wonder if some of these legends around crystal skulls are that data can be stored in these, and perhaps these are computers that can play back information, because it seems to me that if the Atlanteans were so highly advanced, they wouldn't necessarily put all their records on wall carvings, that they might have had some sophisticated computer systems that we aren't aware of yet.
That's a fascinating idea, James. Interesting.
John was talking about how Edgar said that the ancients considered the shape of the cranium to be sacred, and so quartz, quartz is piezoelectric, meaning it can actually emit an electrical charge. Quartz is used to receive and transmit radio waves, and it's also chromoluminous. It can actually emit lights. I grew up in Arkansas, which is the largest singular deposit of quartz on the planet. A lot of people don't realize that. And there is also a fault line that runs through Arkansas called the New Madrid line. And we did a conference called the Law of One Conference in Arkansas in 2012. And just before that, there had been some earthquakes in the area. And I don't know, you may remember this, but there was an incident where 15,000 birds fell out of the sky in Arkansas on January 1st in 2012.
My goodness.
It was on national news. No one knew what had happened. And, I grew up there. My father was an avid outdoorsman, and I had seen that happen several times. And so my theory of what happened is that it's a scientific fact that when you apply mechanical pressure to quartz, it releases an electrical charge. Now, the particular type of bird that fell out of the sky are very sensitive to vibrations. In fact, that's how they migrate. Wow. And so the piezoelectric charge was released from this 170-mile-long deposit of natural quartz in Arkansas, and that it temporarily stunned these highly sensitive birds, and they fell out of the sky and died from blunt trauma on hitting the ground. But I think that was actually the crystals that did that.
My goodness.
And so I think there's a lot of attributes that, Edgar Cayce talked about. A lot of the technology of Atlantis is coming around. And so I've often wondered if perhaps some of these ancient crystal skulls were in truth libraries that store data. And in some time in the future, perhaps we'll be able to actually retrieve data from those.
Wouldn't that be interesting idea, James? We need to check it. Yeah.
Well, Charles Thomas, I've taken an hour of your time, and I cannot tell you how grateful I am. I hold you, and you're just a gentle and wonderful person, and I look forward to seeing you in Colorado. And we will be putting out an advertisement on our newsletters on how people can join the A.R.E. And it is absolutely, in my opinion, in all honesty, the most important spiritual organization on the planet at this time. It carries the energy of the Christos. It carries the humility that is so important on our path of enlightenment. And so, Charles, I honor you deeply, you and your wonderful wife, Leslie, and for all of the people at the A.R.E. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, James, so much. I look forward to seeing you in Colorado in May. Take care of yourself.
Absolutely, and if things work out as we feel they will, perhaps Ann and I will be residents of Virginia Beach at some point in the future.
Oh, we look forward to that, James. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, and thank all
you.
of you for listening. In closing, I would simply like to mention again that we have an incredible group of speakers coming to Colorado. These are all members of the Law of One, and I think that there will be an incredible, beautiful energy in this reunion. Dr. Cayce, Dr. Robert Schock, who is an amazing, gentle, brilliant scientist, John Van Auken, who we believe to be the reincarnation of the Apostle John, Dr. Rick Strassman, Graham Hancock, a brilliant speaker, David Hatcher Childress, the voice of ancient aliens and a really wonderful, warm person, Michelle Nocerino, Joanne Parks and Max, John Major Jenkins, so many more. And thank you all for attending. And again, thank you, Dr. Cayce.